Thank you. The talk for this evening is called The Second Arrow. And we have in the Dharma the ongoing question of how to make our mind a good companion, because our mind is what we live with every day. And to me, this is a very exciting and interesting and often very painful exploration. And a friend of mine who's a therapist told me the other day that his 18-year-old daughter, who has just moved out of home, and she met him at the railway station and burst into tears the minute she saw her father. And she said that all her friends were struggling. There wasn't one friend who wasn't struggling. And I am in the Northern Rivers where 5,000 houses have been severely damaged or destroyed by flood. And there's so many people without homes. And I feel enormous sorrow for everything that we've lost here and for the people that are suffering so deeply. So my friend held his daughter and she cried. And I really think that some of us would like to be held while we cry, or we would like to be held while we enjoy the joy of life, the wonderful joy and the beauty of life. We would like to be held. And there's nothing wrong with having such a longing. It's a beautiful longing, because letting ourselves cry or letting ourselves feel the depth of joy and beauty is part of the intimacy of experience and making the experience welcome. And in this way, we can hold ourselves in the spaciousness of the ancient wisdom. We can hold ourselves. We can let the Dharma hold us. Let the Dharma support us. The Dharma means support. And it's a time where we also might be feeling a huge amount of despair, horror, loss, and grief for everything that's going on in the world. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we willing to touch in with the range of feelings and let them flow without imposing the abstraction of thought on the intimacy of experience? And it is through that intimacy of experience that we reach the depth of the heart of ourselves. And in that heart of ourselves, we can see the sorrow and the joy. They stand together, and we can see the inescapable network of mutuality of all life. And this is how we start to make the mind a good companion. When we touch in with the bodily sensation of our emotional experience, we're less likely to get caught in what is called the second arrow. And there's a whole sutta called the Sala Sutta, the Arrow Sutta. And I think it's sort of Buddha Dharma 101 is the second arrow. We need to be reminded about it all the time. It's very easy to forget about how frequent we just add the second arrow onto experience. And I was just thinking a little while before about that quote from Shakespeare, which says something like the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You can already see in that quote, they've added the second arrow onto it in the outrageous. So we have an experience, and then there's aversion, and then there's outrage. So Shakespeare was onto it. It was probably Hamlet. Everything comes from Hamlet, but maybe not. Liz would know. So we don't want to be adding that second arrow on, because it adds a layer of, there's some sort of painful thing happens, and then we add another layer on it, and that's called the second arrow. So for example, this is a very simple example. So if, for example, we're bitten by a dog, that's the first arrow, which is something we couldn't have controlled. Something, we're walking along the street, a dog bites us, we can't control that. And following that bite, we take the necessary health precautions and we leave it at that. Or we can get caught in stabbing ourselves with a second arrow by means of aversive thoughts about, for example, about dogs, about creating and escalating anxiety about the possibility of a bad infection and so on. This is what the mind does, doesn't it? Churns along like that. So the process of watching the mind is ongoing. We need to really have good attention to the mind. Now, it's not an unlikely thing that the bite does develop an infection. So there's another first arrow. We did what we could to prevent the infection, but we couldn't prevent it. So there's an infection. We then do not want to add a second arrow of self-recriminations on ourselves, of saying, I didn't do enough for the bite, or there's angry thoughts about the dog, and on and on. So we've got to notice that these arrows keep coming. There's lots of first arrows, and we tend to get them very muddled up in our mind by adding on the second arrow and not noticing. They just keep coming, and we need to see the first arrow as such without building, in this case, a if only story about how we might have handled the wound and so on. There's a woman called Violet Weingarten who wrote a long time ago in the 1970s. She wrote a memoir of her chemotherapy treatment, and she asked the question, and you'll have to excuse there's languaging, so there's a language warning, but I'm doing a quote here. So she asks the question in her memoir, is life too short to be taking shit, or is life too short to be minding it? You see the first and second arrow in there? So shit happens, that's the first arrow, and the minding it becomes the second arrow, where we're making a big deal out of it. We're adding a whole lot of stuff on. So in other words, is life too short to be caught in aversion to whatever difficulty is happening? Aversion's a very contracted state of being. So when one is actually faced with mortality, as Violet Weingarten was, and in our case, when we have meditated on the 3 marks of existence, suffering, impermanence, and not self, then it's more likely that such an awareness will come easily. We will see the first and second arrows, and we will see the impermanence, the suffering, and the not self aspect of it. So Weingarten's question is a contemporary summary, I see, of the Buddha's teaching. Life is short, so why add what he called the second arrow to difficulties, to the slings and arrows that Shakespeare mentioned? So if we are not facing a life-threatening or terminal illness, then it can be much harder to let go of the second arrow. What Weingarten calls minding it is we can't let go of that because we are not so acutely aware of the provisionality of life. So we need to really pay a lot of attention to that provisionality of life, which is much more in front of your awareness when you're dealing with illness, especially life-threatening illness. And there was a similar comment from a dying woman that's recounted in a book by Anne Lamott. She wrote a wonderful book on writing titled Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing and Life. It's a wonderful book about writing and creativity. And Anne talks about going shopping with a longtime friend called Pammy, who has 1 month to live, and Pammy's in a wheelchair. And Anne is shopping for a dress, and she tries a dress on, and she comes out to show the dress to Pammy. And Anne describes how she's feeling incredibly self-conscious because she usually wears baggy clothes to cover up her body. And she says to Pammy, because the dress is a very good fit, that's part of the self-consciousness, she says to Pammy, do you think it makes my hips look too big? We all know how we can get caught up in that sort of thinking. And Pammy replies very slowly to Anne, she says, Annie, I really don't think you have that kind of time. What a beautiful, beautiful statement about how we use up our precious time on trivialities of the mind, of comparisons, of identities, of perfection. And the second arrow in a different form. None of us have that time, regardless of how long each one of us will live. Do we want to spend our time minding things? It is a very difficult practice to notice that second arrow. So if we look at that, if we look at how it happens, if we look in more detail of how that happens in the mind, first there's the perception of hips. No, there's another perception that goes before that, isn't there? There's a whole cultural thing about how we should look, which gets deeply embedded in our psyche. And so that's the background. And then there's the perception of hips. And so the second arrow is that add-on. And the add-on is too big, to something, to the other. And there is suffering. And the further add-ons, body not okay, not good enough, not slim enough, and so on and so on. So we just keep doing second arrows. We don't have time for this kind of thinking, because then our mind becomes an unpleasant companion. And so that second arrow, it's not easy because it arrives enormously quickly and instantaneously. And so it's a powerfully liberating practice to notice it. And we can give ourselves time to notice it. We don't have to notice it instantaneously. We're probably not going to, but you start to see that narrative unfolding, and often it's a familiar narrative, that second arrow. And another aspect that makes it quite difficult is the deeply entrenched ancient narratives that are hard to dislodge. So, and I need to also add that if we do notice the second arrow, it doesn't mean that the pain of the first arrow is going to disappear straight away, but we're not magnifying the pain of the first arrow. And it's more likely to just move through without lodging there by creating a big narrative about it. So what happens with these deeply entrenched and ancient stories that we have, often they're based in trauma. So according to the Dharma map and the map that you can verify yourself, what we notice is that there is contact at the sense doors, your doors of perception, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and the consciousness that brings the awareness of it. So let's look at an example. You have experienced, for example, you've experienced some kind of abandonment in the distant past. Many of us would relate to that. And this experience is stored in your bodily memory, in your cellular memory. And it is triggered by anything that looks like abandonment. So you send a text, the person doesn't reply. Someone gives you the cold shoulder. Your call is not returned. Your email is not returned. You're not given appreciation for something that you do for another. You're not invited to a gathering that includes lots of your friends. There's long list, and I can see some of you shaking, nodding your heads in understanding of this. This is an experience of all of us. All of us have these experiences. So the sense door of seeing or hearing has contact with the event. Let's just take the unreplied text or the absence of the invitation. Then there is a feeling that goes with that, and that feeling is going to be pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So in this case, it's going to be unpleasant. And that feeling creates the conditions for craving to get rid of that unpleasant feeling. And so some of you will be already aware that we're tracking through the links of dependent arising. So dependent on the six senses, there is contact. Dependent on contact, there is feeling. So in this case, unpleasant. Dependent on either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral is craving, also known as thirst, followed by clinging, which is a more specific form of craving. So in the effort to get rid of the feeling, we may react in many different habitual ways, or we may simply react to the feeling by trying to get rid of it. And as I said, this only magnifies its intensity. That is the second error. If we remember this sequence, and I mean, some people think that dependent arising incredibly dry and boring, but I just find it fabulous and wonderful. Get so excited when I think, and I also, it's such a map for analyzing what's going on in your mind and for just noticing and asking yourself good questions. What am I clinging to now? What am I craving, and so on? But look, I totally understand if you think you just don't want to have anything to do with dependent arising. But you can start noticing the second arrow. So if we remember that sequence, we can track back to the event and maybe further back to the childhood experiences that have established that cellular memory. And we don't need to go and drown back in the past, but it just gives us an insight into this is not self. This is a sequence of events of reciprocal causality, isn't it? It is not about me or mine. And it gives us a little bit of space in the situation. Because otherwise we feel like we're quite fused with the past memory, that we can't separate ourselves out from it. And we get really caught in it. So it gives us a little bit of distance. And in using that sequence as a way of analyzing it, gives you, that separation of the awareness of what's going on. So sometimes with mindfulness of bodily pain, we get too close to it and fail to see the craving to get rid of it. And this creates a vicious circle. So sometimes good meditators, we're putting our attention on it, but we're way too close to it and we cannot see the subtlety of craving. We give it the form, my pain, my difficulty, and so on. And is that concretizing it in some way? Concretizing something that is actually fleeting. And some things go on for days. It doesn't feel very fleeting. And but it actually, in terms of our lifespan, it is quite fleeting. And if we can also realize that something, we consumer people, we want immediate satisfaction, but things can go on for days, and we can say, okay, I can tell this is going to go on for days, and then eventually it stops. And what's so important is that you notice the absence of it. We often forget to notice the absence. It's absolutely part of becoming aware of the shifting and changing sands of our internal world. Remembering to notice the absence. And it may sound complicated, but it is simply recognizing what we regard as unpleasant, even if we just stay with that we know that unpleasant is going to create clinging, and pleasant is also pleasant will create clinging. And remembering this is that we can notice when the trouble's going to start, when we are going to start trouble for ourselves, so that we're careful not to notice the push, that we're careful to notice the push of Vedana, of the unpleasant feeling, into that craving and clinging. And then we can see, as I said, we can see the conditioned nature of experience, and we can start to let go those habitual patterns. And there starts to be an unraveling. An unraveling is we often use unraveling in other ways, but unraveling is a wonderful process, because unraveling actually means revealing. And what is revealing is something that is wanting to come forth, that is different to the contraction of craving, and is different to the contraction of being caught in a sense of a concretized self, suffering self. And that unraveling will take us deep into our creative being, and our loving being, and our expansive being. So that's what I would like to leave you with today, and thank you for listening. Let's just have a moment of silence.